Patricia was just telling us about this weird, different environment that we're seeing ahead of the elections on Sunday, as the Sunday vote is now widely seen as rigged. Give us your take.
Well, this presidential election has no credibility. The electoral authorities that are supposed to be supervising this process report to Maduro, to the dictator of Venezuela, to the executive branch. And there is no independent official domestically or internationally, because the government has rejected electoral international observers to watch this process. And as Patricia just said, the main leaders of the opposition are either under house arrest or in prison, or like Capriles, disqualified to compete in this process.
We, of course, hear about severe shortages of food, medicines. What's the situation in terms of the humanitarian crisis there in Venezuela, and how's that being involved with giving greater political control, actually, to the authorities?
The humanitarian crisis that Venezuelans are facing is real and dramatic. Shortages of food and medicine. In a context of hyperinflation is extremely difficult, especially for those poor Venezuelans, to survive in this context. And the government, including Maduro himself, has implicitly and sometimes explicitly threatened the population of Venezuela that those ones who are getting some food under price control, which is essentially to survive in Venezuela, they should participate in this process. And most of Venezuelans believe that the government has the capacity to find out whether they participated, and secondly, whether they were supporting the government in this particular case, whether they voted for Maduro or not. So the environment in Venezuela is not only very tense, but most of Venezuelan people feel under some degree of extortion by a government who is using access to food under price control to get support for the dictator to ensure 6 more years in power in Venezuela.
So, Jose Miguel, take us forward to Monday after the election. If, as is widely expected, Mr. Maduro does prevail, what will be different? Will there be changes? Will he effectuate changes, or will it be more of the same?
Domestically, it's going to be more of the same. He will probably celebrate another 6 years under full control of the country. But internationally, these elections have been already discredited by most of the international community, most of democracies in Latin America, the U.S. government, Canada, the European Union has requested to suspend this process for lack of credibility. I anticipated that internationally, Venezuela and Venezuelan officials, those ones involved in human rights abuses as well as corruption, are going to suffer additional sanctions from the European Union, from the U.S. and Canada, and from main democracies in Latin America.
But Mr. Blanco, there have been sanctions already. They don't seem to have had much effect. Why would they have effect if they just increase the sanctions?
The sanctions, actually, I think, are hurting the government. Key members of the administration of Maduro are under sanctions in terms of freezing their assets, most of these illegitimate assets outside Venezuela, and canceling visas for them to travel freely to the region in Latin America and Europe, and obviously the U.S. And this is an important issue for them because every time that they meet with the opposition, the local opposition, their first demand is to ask them to persuade the international community to suspend these sanctions. I do believe that the best way for the international community is to increase those sanctions and increase the numbers of officials that should be under these sanctions for canceling visas, essentially, and freezing their illegitimate assets outside Venezuela.
We've had Colombian, Brazilian government officials on our show, and they've talked about hundreds of thousands of Venezuelan migrants just flooding their countries. What's the potential right now at this point that we could see an escalation into a major regional crisis?
Particularly in Colombia. Colombia is facing a very, very serious exodus, immigration of mostly poor Venezuelans who are escaping from insecurity and lack of food and medicine. And this is creating a very serious burden for countries like Colombia and some states in Brazil that are at the border with Venezuela. That's why, some of these governments have requested cooperation from the international community to provide medicine in particular, but also food for those refugees that are located at the border between Venezuela, Brazil, and Colombia in particular.